Amit Sengupta is a physician, a health practitioner, and for, I don't know, 20, 25 years that I've known him, he's been doing a global health watch, which parallels the social watch of which I am part of since the governments of the world committed in 1995 to eradicate poverty and to achieve gender equity. Not that we believe then, but we say, hey, we should come back on those promises. They are important enough for us to follow. And I think the promises made on health are also important enough. But apparently the governments have come to the conclusion that they cannot deliver on them and that the private sector will deliver instead. Is that happening, Ahmed? And what is the problem of this increased 40 to 60% of private sector participation in health delivery that Jim was talking about?
Thanks, Roberto. But before I get to the question, just to say that it's such a pleasure for the People's Health Movement to be here. And our central motto, which is the struggle for health, is linked to your struggle. And both our struggles are linked, inseparable, and connected. So thank you very much for having me here. Just to remind ourselves that this is the 40th year of the Alma Ata Declaration. We tend to forget. Memory is important. Because the Alma Ata Declaration in '78, some would say even before the ink was dry on the declaration, there were in motion processes to undermine what was actually a very bold initiatives by countries of the world, by the WHO and the UNICEF. Because the Alma Ata Declaration was about people taking charge of their lives and of health in deciding what kind of health systems that we should have. Now, coming back to what you asked, we've had a transition in the last 30 years. So the 80s and 90s was all about the bank, the big bank, the World Bank, and various other international institutions telling us that we spend too much on things that don't matter, like health and education. And so countries should stop spending on health and have the private sector take over that role, because the private sector was seen to be more efficient, better placed, cleaner to provide basic services such as healthcare. The 2000s, the compelling evidence of the breakdown of healthcare services forced a correction of some sorts by international agencies, including the bank, who now started saying you should increase public spending on healthcare, but with a caveat. So you had universal health coverage, not care. For people like me, or like us in public health, coverage is not public health language, it is insurance language. So unfortunately, in many places of the world, universal health coverage has become public expenditure, but private provision of healthcare services. So in a sense, public support to an expansion of healthcare services, and this is happening in many parts of the world. Now, in fact, a few years back, when I asked this question in a meeting, a fairly high-level meeting, and someone from an UN agency, both the person and the agency will remain unnamed, quoted Deng Xiaoping to me and said that for us, the color of the cat doesn't matter as long as it catches mice, meaning that it does not matter whether provision is public or private as long as people get services. It matters. It matters fundamentally, because it's not just about public spending, it's also about public provisioning. Because all the success stories of public health, whether it's Costa Rica, or Thailand, or Cuba, are those of public provisioning of services. And that is what is at stake today. Because in countries which achieved a fairly high degree of public provisioning, we are seeing those public infrastructure being brought down brick by brick. Now, there was this German gentleman called Goebbels a few decades back, who said that if you repeat a lie enough times, there'll be some people who will start believing you. And that's what we are seeing. It's been repeated again and again, that private services are efficient, that private services deliver. It's a lie without an iota of actual evidence that that's true. But that's what we see repeated over and over. I think linked to that, and I'll end here, linked to that is also the demise of the UN system, where today a Bill Gates is more important to how governance of health takes place across the world than the director of the WHO. We have public-private partnerships, not just in provisioning, but in governance, in Gavi, in Global Fund, that were deliberately kept outside the UN system so that corporations and private foundations could have a place in the high table. And this is something, as Rudolf Virchow said, do we not see all that we do wrong in the health of the people? Clearly, we are doing something very wrong today, and this must change.
Thank you, Amit. That's just a start, because we do have to look much more closer at that role of corporations and foundations, particularly in the health sector. And I would want to go back to Amit on something that you were saying about the contradictions between the market and the right to health, and how is that being exacerbated, while actually what many people are preaching is public-private partnerships as the solution for those governments that don't have enough money or are implementing this kind of austerity programs?
Well, I think first it's important for us to understand and underline there's nothing like a public-private partnership. It's a misnomer. What you have is out and out handing over what are public services built by the blood, sweat, and toil of people across generations to the private sector. Now, you may want to give it a nice name and call it a partnership. You can't have a partnership. It's like the lion and the goat and asking them to be in a partnership. There's nothing like a public-private partnership. So what we are seeing is the proposition that is put forward, an ideological proposition, that countries in the public sector are inefficient in handling public services, and that is why you need the private sector to bail you out to provide services. And how that happens is very interesting, and some of the panelists brought that out. What you start by is privatizing some sections of the operation in a hospital, say. So diet services, ambulance services, cleaning services, they are privatized, and you still say, but clinical services are still not privatized. And then finally, when clinical services are privatized, there's nobody left to speak for them. So you are seeing actually a very deliberate manner in which a certain ideological position that the private sector is superior is put forward. It's important to build the counter discourse. Why the public sector is superior for us is not just ideological, it's practical. It is deeply rooted in an understanding of public health. Public services are superior because they're economies of scale. Public services are superior because they don't suffer from the problem of moral hazard, which basically means that the likelihood that you're going to be cheated because somebody in a private hospital wants to make more money is not going to happen in public services. And finally, public services are important because the private sector, especially in countries, poorer countries like India, where I come from, will not go into areas where people don't have money in their pockets. So even now, in countries such as India, where we are giving up chunks of healthcare to the private sector, they only concentrate themselves around the metropolitan cities and consign the public sector to keep providing services to remote areas, to areas which are the poorest, to areas where you have large tribal populations, etc. So there are various reasons why public services are superior, and this is a counter discourse that is very important for us, for unions such as the Public Services International, to mount a counterattack. Because finally, today, because this question has also come up, how can a union like the PSI make a difference? Now, I think, unfortunately, the days when you can make a difference through dialogue is increasingly getting over. Increasingly, countries in the north as well in the south are under the neoliberal discourse, the global neoliberal regime, under the influence of global capital. And so what matters, finally, is the number of people that we can today put on the streets, the number of people that we can mobilize. And it is there, I think, that unions such as the PSI have a role in now starting to play the leadership role in the health movement, in organizing people to convert healthcare from what is being seen as a charity that people like Bill Gates is going to dole out to something that is a right. Unions know how to mobilize. Unions know how to organize. They need to take the intellectual leadership of the health movement in different parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Irina. I am being told that we are running out of time, which is very unfair because we started late, and there are so many issues that were left out of that discussion, but not out of our minds. Let me just mention, for example, you all heard about Transparency International, which is the organization, anti-corruption organization. They used to be looking mainly at governments for corruption. Now, in their latest report, they look at corporate sector too. And what do they find? Who is the most corrupt corporate sector? We all probably have our favorite, but according to Transparency International, it's the pharmaceutical sector, of which we haven't spoken enough, and we won't, but let's keep it in our minds. Let's also, yes, you wanted to intervene. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Colleagues, I mean, it's wonderful to be here. Like I said, the partnership with PSI is going from strength to strength. But I would challenge some of this debate. Public versus private is not a binary. It is not 0-1. It is not black and white. There are, to quote one of the best-selling books from a couple of years ago, there are 50 shades of gray in the public-private discussions. So we have to recognize that not everything is good versus bad, first and foremost. And I think part of what the challenge is, in terms of the role of your trade union, is the information and understanding. It's not just the advocacy has value, mobilization has value, getting members on the streets has value, but it's also what information, who do you represent, what percentage of the workforce, what are the challenges that are ongoing around the world. We looked, for instance, to try and get data on how many current industrial labor disputes are ongoing today. And there is no public domain information on that. It's disparate. It's thrown around the world. And this is a role that, as you're thinking, how do you get your voice to the global stage? How do you get your voice to the national stage, local, sub-regional stages? What's that information that you hold that has real value to bring to the debate and to challenge some of the discussions that are ongoing? Thank you.
Those were very long 30 seconds. Amit.
15 seconds. Yes, I think the pursuit of the gray is elegant, but unfortunately, in some situations, it is a binary. It is a binary when people die. When in the pursuit of the gray rather than the white or the black, when people die, I think it becomes a binary. And that is what we are seeing today. We are seeing that the rise of the private sector means that too many people are dying when they should not be dying. I don't think this is a situation when we can look for the shades of gray. We have to look for black and white, because when you go black, people die. That's the unfortunate situation in the health sector today. Sorry.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's getting exciting. Now, if you want to read more about this, here comes the commercial. This Spotlight report has been launched recently, and this is a joint work and a partnership where Public Service International played a major part, and I think there are copies of the report still out there, but it is available from the website of Public Service International. And the Spotlight report is a joining forces of women groups, Third World Network, unions like Public Service International, Social Watch, Global Policy Forum, and many other organizations, taking the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the commitment of 193 governments of the world towards a society that is just, fair, respect natural boundaries, achieves gender equity within justice and with more equality. All of that our governments have promised, so it's time to go to them and ask, what are you doing about those promises? And the title is precisely Reclaiming Policies for the Public, which probably addresses a lot of the questions that this wonderful panel did not have enough time to answer. But an applause to all of them that have shown the strength and the relevancy of health workers on the ground doing work for all of us. Thank you.